1986, a judge in Los Angeles dismissed rape charges against a defendant who was accused of raping a victim who was classified as a prostitute. The judge reasoned his decision by saying, basically, anyone who goes out on the street and prostitutes themselves takes themselves outside the protection of the law. That's a fundamental understanding. Who would believe a prostituted person anyway? And mind you, I'm really cleaning up the language to take out the offensiveness. In 2007, in this city, a judge in the municipal court unit dismissed the rape charges against another victim, classified as a prostitute. She said, and this was a case where the defendant was accused of holding a gun against the victim's head and raping her and having other individuals rape her. And this judge said, proceeding against this defendant demeans real rape victims. I thought this was a robbery. She didn't get paid. My name is Jennifer Long. I'm the director of Equitas, as Rochelle said, and a former prosecutor. And Equitas shares its name with the Roman goddess for equity and fairness. And our name really underscores our philosophy. We don't just believe in applying the law. We believe in the application of the law in a just manner. As part of our mission, and our mission is to enhance the criminal justice response to gender-based violence and human trafficking. And let me just say that I understand our role in this as the criminal justice system is in many ways reactive. But I don't think that it can be dismissed. I think when it is ignoring crimes, ignoring victims, being ineffective, it undermines all of the efforts of all of the people, probably everyone in this room, who are working so hard on these issues. But so we recognize this, and we work to accomplish our mission in two main ways. We identify promising practices, and we look at them, we adapt them, we evaluate them, we refine them, and then we share them with prosecutors around the globe. And we learn so much from every jurisdiction we're in, and that enhances our work with other prosecutors and allied professions. The second way we do this is by identifying bad practices, problematic practices, and we try and address those by challenging them, by looking at research and information and trying to come up with better strategies to be implemented in their place. Our staff are all former prosecutors, including myself, and we all have specialization in gender-based violence or human trafficking. And I think that all the audience and participant members who've been working on these issues know that having a specialization in one area really enhances your response to both areas. In fact, it helps us better identify and respond and develop strategies to these crimes. As a prosecutor and in my role at Equitas, I have become acutely aware of the law, particularly the criminal justice system's need to classify things. And in some ways, that's very positive. It gives you notice and understanding of what's to come. So in my world, we classify the laws that we enforce as criminal versus civil. We look at the law that we follow, we might divide it as persuasive versus precedential. We classify ourselves as prosecutors, as representatives of the jurisdiction in which we're supposed to enforce the laws, be it the city or county, the Commonwealth, the state, or the United States, versus the representative of a victim. And we classify laws by their severity, misdemeanor or felony. Now, in some ways that classification has a lot of benefits. It puts people on notice as to the conduct that the community thinks is wrong, criminal. It puts individuals on notice as to the punishments that they should expect. And sometimes the criminal justice system wants to classify victims for very good reasons. For example, domestic violence victims or human trafficking victims. We may classify them as those type of victims to give them enhanced benefits, to make things available like UNT visas. But historically, when the criminal justice system has sought to classify victims, it has done so to the detriment to those victims, to the detriment to justice, and with a real bias. And nowhere is this more apparent than when a victim is classified as a prostitute. In this venue, when we're talking about human trafficking, it gives us a good opportunity to revisit this, because this classification, it becomes very critical in the prosecution and in the criminal justice response to human trafficking. Now, before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the debate that has been going on for probably 100 years or more, and will continue to go on, about sex work, prostitution, the terms that should be used. Is sex work empowering? Or is sex work per se sexual exploitation? Are individuals involved in the sex trade sex workers or prostituted women or men? Are individuals who use prostitution, are they purchasers of johns, or are they rapists? And these are good debates. They're healthy debates. Unfortunately, though, sometimes the debates overshadow the agreement that we all have. And in this one case, regardless of where your philosophy is, in terms of, this issue, what we all stand united in agreement is that nobody deserves or is to be blamed for being raped, murdered, or beaten because of their classification as whatever. It's not the way our justice system is set up in theory, and we'll talk about the difference between theory and practice, and it's not the way morality or other pieces are set up. Now, one of the similarities between gender-based violence and human trafficking is that generally we identify the victim before the perpetrator is known. And it's in the critical moments when the criminal justice system encounters the victim that classification happens, and that classification, unfortunately, drives the response. And as I gave you the examples already, and as many of you in the room know, when you're classified as a person in prostitution, the response can go from disbelief to tolerance to downright vindictive belief that an individual deserved what happened to them. In 2010, a publication called On the Issues published a story by a woman named Annie Sprinkle. And she talked about her life 2 decades working as a prostitute. Her words, describing herself. And saying, look, 2 decades in this life, and I can tell you that homicide, beatings, hate crimes, rapes, they are unreported, they are unaddressed, they are unpunished. Nobody cares about individuals who are classified as prostitutes. People may say we're trash, that we deserve it, that somehow we had it coming. And in listening to that, there was an acknowledgement of the status quo. Now, I'm happy to say, as Rochelle said, I was a prosecutor in the city 17 years ago now. And that description is not an accurate description of every person. There are amazing prosecutors, judges, defense attorneys out there who truly understand the issues. And I can tell you that when a case came across our desk, I served under Lynn Abraham. It didn't matter how an individual was classified. We were aggressive, we were ethical, but we went after those cases. But unfortunately, that cannot be generalized to the rest of the country. In far too many places, that's not the response, and it needs to be. Now, I said in theory, when you read the laws, they don't categorize the status of the victim. And that's because the laws are not focused on the victim. I mean, we talk about victim-centered prosecution, but they're offender-focused, and that's how we should be. They look at the conduct of the perpetrator, and that drives it. So if a perpetrator is sexually exploiting a minor, forcing or defrauding or coercing an adult to sexual exploitation, then the human trafficking law is implicated. If an individual uses sexual violence against another person, then the rape and sexual assault laws are implicated, regardless of the classification of the victim. That's the rule of law. But as the Urban Institute recently wrote, there is a gap between the law in the books and the law in action. And in practice, there are some serious gaps between the two. Let me just highlight one example for the lawyers or criminal justice people in the room, the Rape Shield Law. Rape Shield Law was enacted to protect victims, to limit the use of a victim's sexual history in terms of establishing whether or not they consented in a rape case, or basically challenging their report, their allegation that they were raped. And by and large, it's seen as victim protection, except it even isn't blind. You know, there are a lot of legal scholars looking around now to revise this model penal code, which incorporates the Rape Shield Law. And even those scholars, experts at the law, well-read, well-versed, are still looking at prostitution as something that is relevant to determine a victim's consent. In fact, if you read case law, you will see historically that is looked at. And what is that based on? It's based on common sense, in quotes. It's based on the historical treatment of the law. But it's not based on the research. And if you work or ever talk with anyone who's in the life, or if you look at and there's one great study out there about how work and prostitution impacts not only the determination of whether you would consent in a particular situation, and we don't really need a study as individuals to let us know that, but not only that, but it also let us know that women in prostitution weren't any more likely to falsely report a rape against them. They were more likely, however, never to report a rape against them because of the normalization of violence in their life. That's something that's not captured in the law, but it's a place where the classification of an individual as a prostitute has real consequences. So what can we do? What would be the impact if we turn this around and implemented the law on the ground, the law that looks at offenders? And how would this help not only justice, but also help the fight against human trafficking? Well, for one, justice is blind. And as prosecutors and the law, there are not two courthouses, one for victims we like, blameless victims, and one for victims who we don't like, that we don't think are in need of protection. That's not only consistent with what's morally just, it's consistent with the letter of the law, it's consistent with justice. The second thing that we would do is we would recognize that regardless of the classification of someone as a human trafficking victim, or as a sex worker, or as something along the continuum, either the pathways into the life, the child sexual abuse, or the violence that they may have witnessed beforehand, or if they were not a victim of violence beforehand, the frequency and severity of the violence to which they are subjected in their everyday life is real. And so the recognition of looking at what offenders do without a label to victims would have a real serious impact on holding people accountable for their crimes against individuals. Number 3, it would get some very, very dangerous people off the street. In 2003, during his guilty plea, Gary Ridgway, who is the Green River Killer out of Seattle, talked about why he killed so many prostituted women. I hate prostitutes, he said. I knew that I could kill as many as I wanted, and they'd probably go unreported. No one would be looking for them. I killed them because I didn't want to pay for sex. Gary Ridgway. In 2008, the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation published a book of quotes by purchasers of sex. You don't have the right, she doesn't have the right once I pay her to say no. If we agree on something after I pay her, she can't change her mind halfway through. If there's a prostitute out there, I don't have to rape my wife. And it goes on and on. There is a myth out there that individuals who purchase sex are topless and shy. And some might be. But there is a world of individuals who are violent and who know exactly what the least risk is of going after someone that the criminal justice system has basically stigmatized and said doesn't matter. And finally, this would identify perpetrators of human trafficking. What do we think happens? I mean, we've heard from Tina, from other people today about the age in which people are recruited and brought into the life. And the fact that our mechanisms for identifying and responding to this are weak, and there are a lot of gaps in them. So if we're only identifying a few victims, what happens to the rest of them that don't escape? and don't go on to a different life, or that aren't murdered or killed or otherwise dead because of their life. They are still in the life. And maybe when they came to us, instead of looking at them as someone to be disbelieved or not a real victim, if we took the time to look at the police reports, and mind you, they will be police reports of the arrest of these individuals, and the older these individuals are, the more likely or not that some of these reports will be juvenile arrests, which still happens today, but certainly happened with more frequency before. And if we sat down and talked to these individuals, we might get some information about who these traffickers are who are still out there and are still acting with impunity. In 2009, actually is when we started Equitas. A lot of us were doing the work from well before then. But we started Equitas in 2009. We were doing work on this issue and we sat down with a human trafficking activist, and he was actually someone who co-authored that report that I mentioned. And we talked about how he saw this issue. And he said, this issue being the response to human trafficking. And he said, historically, we're doing a better job of identifying and responding to human trafficking victims. The problem is, we don't do a good job of responding to gender-based violence. So we're at a point right now where we're trying to catch up the response to prostituted women up to a point that's not so great where it is against non-prostituted women, general gender-based violence. And when I hear that in 2009 and I sit here in 2014, I know we've made strides, but we haven't made enough. And I really believe that if we close this gap, we can do so much to take dangerous people off the street, keep our communities safer, and really give the victim all that they can.